The sun was just beginning to set behind the mountains, casting an amber glow across the landscape. Jacob sat in his Jeep, his hands gripping the worn steering wheel, eyes scanning the rugged terrain ahead. It was the perfect moment, the kind he'd been dreaming about for years. The Jeep, an old but reliable Wrangler, was more than just a car to him. It was a companion, a partner in his quest for adventure. Jacob had always loved off-roading. There was something about the freedom of driving through untamed landscapes that spoke to his soul. But this particular trip was different. It was a culmination of a dream he had nurtured since childhood, to complete the Great Desert Trail, an off-road route that spanned over 500 miles of desert, mountain passes, and isolated wilderness. It was a journey that few attempted, and even fewer completed. His Jeep had been through a lot in its life. It had been his first car, and over the years, Jacob had poured his heart and soul into it. Countless modifications had been made. A custom suspension lift, upgraded tires, and a powerful engine that purred like a lion ready to pounce. He had even painted it a deep forest green, his favorite color, to give a rugged yet sleek appearance. Jacob and his Jeep had been through a lot together. They had tackled mud-strewn paths, crossed rivers, and taken on mountain roads that most people wouldn't even think of driving on. But the desert trail was a different beast altogether. It wasn't just about speed or power. It was about endurance, preparation, and resilience. It was about the ability to push through the harshest conditions and emerge on the other side stronger. The first few days of the journey had been relatively easy. The Jeep hummed along the sand dunes with ease, its 4x4 capabilities making quick work of the difficult terrain. The sun beat down relentlessly, but Jacob didn't mind. There was something magical about being in the middle of nowhere, surrounded only by the vast desert and the open sky. It gave him a sense of freedom, a sense of peace. But on the fourth day, everything changed. Jacob had reached a particularly treacherous section of the trail, a stretch of land known as the Devil's Spine, where the desert met the mountains. The trail was narrow, winding, and filled with sharp rocks. The heat was suffocating, and there was no sign of civilization for miles in any direction. It was here that Jacob's true test began. The Jeep had been performing well so far, but as Jacob navigated a steep incline, he heard a sudden, unsettling sound. A loud crack echoed through the stillness of the desert. His heart skipped a beat as he slammed the brakes and looked at the dashboard. The oil pressure gauge was flashing red. "Not now," Jacob muttered to himself, his heart racing. He pulled over to the side of the trail, sweat dripping down his brow. The Jeep had always been reliable, but even the best machines have failed. He popped the hood and stared at the engine. It wasn't immediately obvious what had gone wrong, but the damage was real. He knew he was in trouble. But Jacob was no stranger to adversity. He had grown up fixing cars with his father, learning the ins and outs of mechanics. He had spent countless weekends under the hood, tuning engines and replacing parts. This wasn't the end of the road for him. Not yet. He rummaged through his toolbox, pulling out a few spare parts he had brought along for just such an emergency. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Jacob worked tirelessly, his hands covered in grease. The desert night was silent, but the Jeep's engine was a constant companion. Its hum a reminder of the challenge that lay ahead. Hours passed before Jacob felt a surge of hope. The Jeep's engine turned over smoothly, and the oil pressure gauge returned to normal. With a tired but satisfied smile, he closed the hood and climbed back into the driver's seat. "You're not giving up on me now, are you?" he said, patting the dashboard affectionately. He started the engine, the familiar growl filling the air as the Jeep roared back to life. The worst was behind him, or so he thought. The next morning, Jacob continued his journey, though he was cautious. The trail grew more rugged, and the temperatures soared. He had barely reached the halfway point when he noticed the sky darkening. The wind picked up, kicking up sand and swirling clouds. Jacob's instincts told him something was coming. Suddenly, the storm hit. It wasn't just a dust storm. It was a full-on desert thunderstorm. The wind howled. The rain pounded down in sheets, and visibility dropped to zero. Jacob tried to push forward, but the Jeep's tires were slipping on the slick sand. He could barely see the trail, and the storm made it impossible to navigate safely. He found shelter under a small overhang, hoping the storm would pass quickly. He sat in the Jeep, listening to the roar of the winds and the sound of the rain slapping against the metal roof. He thought about turning back, but something in him refused. This was more than just a journey to him. It was a test of his determination, his will to push through when everything seemed impossible. The storm raged for hours. By the time it finally cleared, Jacob was exhausted, but he knew he had to keep going. The Jeep was still in good condition, and the trail was waiting for him. With renewed resolve, Jacob pressed on. The days ahead were grueling. Long hours of driving to the wilderness with only his Jeep for company. The desert seemed endless, and each mile felt like a battle. But Jacob wasn't alone. The Jeep, with its worn yet powerful frame, was his constant companion, a symbol of resilience and strength. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Jacob reached the end of the trail. He stood on the peak of a hill, overlooking the vast expanse of desert that stretched out before him. The Jeep, covered in dust and dirt, sat proudly behind him. He had done it. Jacob smiled, feeling a sense of accomplishment that no words could fully describe. He had pushed through every challenge, every setback, and had emerged victorious. The Jeep had been with him every step of the way, and together they had conquered the wilderness. As he sat on the hood of the Jeep, watching the sun set over the desert once more, Jacob knew that this was just the beginning. The world was full of adventures waiting to be explored, and his Jeep would be there, ready to take him wherever he wanted to go. For Jacob, this wasn't just about off-roading. It was about finding strength in the journey, embracing the challenges, and never giving up, no matter how tough the road ahead seemed. And as he revved the engine, preparing to head back home, he couldn't help but smile. The adventure of a lifetime had just begun.